Here at the Aussie Wire, we are all about truth, freedom, and hope. And nothing builds hope quite like people who are working on solutions. And sometimes solutions might seem a bit ambitious, a little bit out there. Something like Brexit comes to mind, which was an absolute pipe dream when people first started working on that, and now that's a reality. Whether that's for better or for worse is for you to decide. But nevertheless, it seemed like an impossible dream, and yet now it is reality. An impossible dream, seemingly, that I've come across over the last 10 years has been the idea that maybe we don't have enough states in Australia. And maybe, if we work together intelligently, we might be able to actually add more states. Why would that be a good thing? Why would we even do it in the first place? What problem are we trying to solve? Well, thankfully, I don't have to answer those questions for you because I have David Landini, who is the president of the Riverina State.com.au. Now, David, thank you so much, first of all, for coming on the Aussie Wire.
Great. I'm really pleased to be here, Topher. Look, to be quite frank, I've admired your work from afar. You did for example, you did some great articles on the Murray-Darling Basin disaster a number of years ago. They were really, really good videos, good understanding and a good concern for the problems, the government-caused problems that are in the country. Yeah. And I think they were just really, really good videos. Great job.
Thank you, David. I do appreciate that. And I regret to say that I've only much more recently come across your work. And you actually met me at one of the showings of Battleground Melbourne. You gave me a flyer which ended up on my bedside table. Yep. I get handed a lot of things all the time. All sorts of people want my attention and want me to take up their cause. And I do eventually get to these things and read them. And most of them are not really worth the paper they're printed on. No offense to anyone in particular, but that's the way these things go. But yours was a wonderful exception. The riverinastate.com.au. Now, I didn't put up your lower third, so I'm going to do that now. David Landini, that's the website there. Now, for those who have it's never even crossed most people's minds that we could redraw the map of Australia, much less why we would want to redraw the map of Australia and change the number of states and change where state borders are. So from a beginner's perspective, for someone who's never even considered this before, what problem are we trying to solve here? What are we trying to achieve?
Well, the problem is, Topher, and as you alluded to earlier, there's a lot of problems in the countryside, and a lot of those the problems are actually caused by the government, and there's reasons for that. A lot of our solutions are not really solutions; they're only reactions. They propose a bad bit of legislation or a bad action, and then this is probably not a very nice word to say, but we complain about it. But we don't actually put up a solution. Like, what do we want? What do we want? They make claims, and just for example, they make a lot of claims in the so-called environmental field. Now, we have really, really good farmer representatives and farmer groups that have really put a lot of effort and a lot of research into their industry and also into the rebuttal of those government claims. And they rebut these claims. They prove that what the government has said is incorrect, is wrong. It's based on false premise and there's mistakes all the way through it. And now, I'm not actually a farmer, but I live in the countryside. So I will refer to these farmer groups as our representatives. Sure. So our representatives rebut all the arguments, all the claims that they make that are false, but it doesn't change the circus. The circus continues anyway, and as we've seen most obviously with the Murray-Darling Basin plan, it just continues. It continues regardless. It doesn't matter what our representatives say or do, or how often they prove the government and their representatives wrong. The circus just continues, or the disaster continues, and it is a disaster for the people in the local areas.
Look, you'll get no argument. You'll get no argument from me over the disaster of government intervention and legislation. I've spent a lot of time, as you say, on the Murray-Darling Basin Authority and the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. Yep. You can go back to my Topher Field YouTube channel and see all my work on that. Fundamentally, why don't people in the country, primary producers in particular, but country areas, why don't I'll say we, because I've recently moved out of the big cities and I've actually joined the ranks of country living, and I do love it. Why don't we have any political clout? Why do they ignore these peak bodies and farming bodies? Despite having the evidence on their side, they get ignored. Why?
And that's the problem with TOFA. It's presented as an environmental problem, but it's not. It's actually a political problem. And the politics is caused in New South Wales, and Victoria is exactly the same. It's just a different state, but it's got exactly the same problem. And it's really just a mirror image of New South Wales, or New South Wales is a mirror image of Victoria, take a pick. But in both states, there's a huge concentration of population, electorates, because electorates are based on equal population. And there we have an image of the electorates in New South Wales. There's a total of 93 in the Legislative Assembly, which is the lower house. 71, or over 3/4 of the population and politicians and political power are in those 71 electorates in Newcastle, Sydney and Wollongong.
Yeah.
And the rest of the state has 22 electorates. And that just shows the concentration of power in New South Wales. Now, that's not necessarily a problem, but it's concerning. But if you look at this image here, this is an image of how the electors voted in the last state election in New South Wales, the 2023 election, only a few months old. Now, in that area marked in red, there's a total of 545,993 voters. That's the total number of voters. Now, the number of people who vote for the Greens in New South Wales, and also the Sustainable Australia Party as well. Now, the Sustainable Australia Party is not so well known as the Greens.
Sure.
But they are very green orientated. In fact, they're more green orientated than the Greens.
Sure.
And if you go to their website, I'd never heard of the Sustainable Australia Party. So I went to their website and inspected them. I thought, wow, they're worse than the Greens. But in New South Wales, 556,092 people voted number one for either the Greens or the SAP.
Yeah, wow.
The Sustainable Australia Party. And I'll just read out the precise numbers. 451,344 voted for the Greens and 104,000 odd voted for the Sustainable Australia Party. Now, both those parties are very, very much opposed to the natural resource-based industries that our livelihoods depend on.
Yeah.
We mentioned the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. There's also the timber industry. That's a huge industry throughout New South Wales and Victoria. And those voters are opposed to both those industries. And not only those, but there's also the creation of national parks and so forth. There's a lot of things that come out of those, that come out of the governed area, the areas of Newcastle, Sydney and Wollongong, because that's where the population is. Most of those voters are located in Newcastle, Sydney and Wollongong, and also the north coast of New South Wales. Now, politics is numbers. If you want to get a very, very quick definition of politics, it is numbers. And if you've got the numbers, you will succeed.
Sure.
And if you haven't got the numbers, you will fail. And this may not, all the other stuff that goes on in between, it's fluff.
Sure.
It's just mirages, it's mirrors, it's smoke. It doesn't make any difference. It's theatrics. If you've got the numbers, you'll win. If you haven't got them, you'll lose.
So as you said a moment ago, the problem that we're looking at here in New South Wales is precisely mirrored in Victoria. We have a situation where you're hardline inner city greenies who wouldn't know how to grow a commercial crop, wouldn't know how to feed people, wouldn't know how to produce energy. They actually outnumber the entire population, much less the energy producers, the farmers specifically. This includes people that live in towns, but they actually exceed the entire population. So therefore, those primary producers are politically irrelevant, have no political influence whatsoever. Is that a fair summary?
That is correct, Topher. If you look at those electorates, it doesn't matter. And just for example, I actually stood in the last state election as an independent candidate, as a Riverina State candidate, but we haven't got a registered party at this stage, but that's in the pipeline. So I stood as an independent, but it really wouldn't matter. It doesn't matter who we elect and send to Parliament. You can send me, you can send anyone to Parliament, and even if they're on our side, when they go to the New South Wales Parliament and are basically overwhelmed by the metropolitan population, we are really effectively we are irrelevant.
So what's the solution here? How do we fix a problem like this, mirrored in Victoria as well?
Well, that's it, Topher. Look, I do have some political experience. I was in the National Party for about 10 years. I left them about 6 or 7 years ago because I just realised, and I don't want to upset any National Party voters, but they're actually not on our side. So I left them, and but I looked at the numbers. Sorry, I'll just go back half a step. While I was in that party, I met various politicians, and it was really an exercise in disillusionment. I originally had an opinion and ideas that politicians were actually on our side and they actually wanted to help us. But unfortunately, over time, I come to the realisation that politicians aren't actually on our side, certainly not National Party ones. And I believe it's the same for the Liberal Party as well.
I agree.
In fact, I'm pretty certain it's the same for the Liberal Party. I can't speak for the Labor Party because they were always the opposition, and I don't want to upset any Labor people who support the Labor Party either. But I realised that politicians they're not on our side, but they are on someone's side. And I unfortunately worked it out that they're actually on their side.
Correct. Yeah.
And the problem we have with that is, and this came up in various discussions with the state director of the National Party and the leaders of the National Party and members of Parliament from the National Party. And the reality is they are on their side. They want to get re-elected. That's their number one priority. Now, to get re-elected, they need the support of their party. And I've just jumped away a little bit off track a little bit there. But the second objective of most politicians, the vast majority, is to form government as well. And I suppose I do speak from a National Party perspective, but it's very, very, their second priority is to form government. So the number one priority is to get elected to Parliament and then to form government. Now, to form most of the National Party seats, well, all the National Party seats are in the country areas, New South Wales and Victoria. But for the National Party to form government, they have to be in coalition with the Liberal Party. Now, for the Liberal Party to win seats in the metropolitan areas, they have to appeal to metropolitan voters, including that huge number of people who vote for the Greens and for example, the Sustainable Australia Party. Now, I'll just go back half a step. Now, we all think in Australia that the Greens are a minor party, that the big parties are Liberal, Labor, and then the National Party. Well, no, in reality, there's I think it's twice as many people in New South Wales, and I believe Victoria's the same, nearly twice as many people vote for the Greens than they do for the National Party. So the big parties in Australia and the States are the Liberal Party, the Labor Party, and then the Greens. And then at about half the level of the Greens come out the National Party. So to be elected in the urban areas, politicians must appeal to that Green vote. They have to appeal to it because we have a preferential voting system, which I agree. I think it's a very good electoral system, but very few candidates are elected on the primary vote. It's only a handful are elected on the primary vote. You've got to get 51% of the primary vote or the redistributed vote to be elected. Very few get that 51% straight up. So they rely on the second preference vote of the candidates that get eliminated beforehand. Now, the Greens are the third biggest party, and they're normally the candidate, when they are eliminated, it's normally the Greens candidate that gets eliminated second or third last. And the Greens' second preference vote goes to either the Liberal Party candidate or the Labor Party candidate, and normally wherever the most Greens preferences go, that candidate will win. Now, the problem we have is that these politicians in the urban areas must appeal to that Green second preference vote to be elected. And if they don't, they won't be elected. Now, the problem, of course, is to us that those politicians must follow the Green line. If they don't follow the Green line, they won't be elected. They won't form government. But our problem is for them to be elected, the reality that they have to follow the Green line means that we have this disastrous Murray-Darling Basin plan that is an absolute disaster, economically, socially, culturally throughout the country areas. We also have huge restrictions on the timber industry, and Victoria is already they're in a phase-out area. They're already phasing out native timber harvesting entirely. New South Wales will follow, absolutely no doubt about it. So that's where we suffer, because the politics says that if any candidate in the urban areas, if they want to get elected, they want to form government, they have to do those things. And I looked at that. Unfortunately, this reality dawned on me some time ago, some years ago, because I looked at our representations made to government and all this sort of thing, and they were top of the range in your great series that you did, top of the range stuff. But the disaster rolls on. And then I realised, just in some of my spare time, I just looked at the numbers. And for a start, I was actually stunned myself when I saw the concentration of electorates, because we've often known that, gee, there's a concentration of population out in Newcastle, Sydney, Wollongong, and there's an old joke that NSW stands for New South Wales. Well, politically, it stands for Newcastle, Sydney, and Wollongong.
Sure.
And I don't know how they arrange those cities, that acronym, but anyway, it's a great one. But Victoria is a mirror image. Yeah. Victoria's got 88 state electorates. There's 68 of those around Melbourne, Geelong, and the Mornington Peninsula. There's only another 20 electorates, including the two in Ballarat and one in two in Bendigo and one in Ballarat. There's only another 20 electorates outside of the metropolitan area in Melbourne.
Sure.
So Geelong, Melbourne, and the Mornington Peninsula. So Victoria is a mirror image of New South Wales. So I looked at those. I just looked at the numbers and I thought, nothing's working. Why not? It's honesty and truth, and the facts don't work. And then I realised it's the politics. We have a political problem. And then I looked at the numbers and I come to the conclusion that these problems are insurmountable.
Yeah.
They're insurmountable in New South Wales, and I do draw on my experience in the National Party. Doesn't matter what we say or do. If these things cannot be fixed politically in New South Wales, and I believe Victoria is the same. They can't be fixed in Victoria as well.
Now, can I interrupt for a second? I apologise. I'm getting a warning here saying that your internet bandwidth is low. That's why your image has shrunk there. I tried to fix it, but it's there we go. It seems to be happier now. But anyway, please just ignore what's happening on the screen. We're going to continue with this conversation because I think it's too important to allow just some NBN issues to really stop us from having this conversation. So given these are some observations that the kinds of observations that once you make them or once you say them to somebody, they seem obvious. Well, yes, of course. I mean, it's staring us in the face. And yet, if you haven't yet realized them, the moment of realization would be quite a life-changing one. And it was in your case. It really kind of transformed and changed the direction that you were heading in. So what was the solution that you landed on to try and fix a problem like that?
Well, I realised that in the current situation, these problems are insurmountable, and I thought, well, is there a solution? Do we just dry up and blow away, and that's the end of the story for us, or is there another solution? Now, I am a bit of an historian, and the Riverina area of New South Wales, which is sort of starts around your area now, Topher, around Albury, east of Albury, even. Around up to the Murrumbidgee, around Wagga and to the South Australian border, that's historically the Riverina, but it's even bigger than that. But the Riverina has always had a separatist attitude. The first attempt to form a Riverina colony was back in the 1860s.
All right.
Back in the 1860s. Yeah, and on the website, there's some historical documents there, and there's the original petition to the New South Wales. I'm not sure what it was called, the Colonial Office, because they were colonies back then. But way back in the 1860s, there was a real sentiment to separate from New South Wales, and there's a number of reasons for that. So I was aware of this sentiment already, and it's often been mentioned that the Riverina should separate from New South Wales because really there's a bit more to it than just the economic, the bad legislation and the poor economics that comes out of that area. But culturally, commercially, we don't. Most of the original pioneers from this area came up via Victoria, which might seem a bit strange, but they did. They came up through a lot straight up through Melbourne, a lot through the goldfields, Bendigo and Ballarat, and come into this way because we're only a 3 to 4 hour drive from Melbourne, but we're an 8 to 9 hour drive depending on what area of the Riverina, but from Sydney, and all our original population, most of it come up through Victoria. All our commerce goes down via Victoria. So we're actually not New South Wales orientated. It's all Australian rules. It's Victorian beer and all that sort of stuff. Culturally, we really don't have much relationship to New South Wales anyway. So I was already aware of this sentiment. So this separatist sentiment. So I thought, well, could this be a solution to our problem? And in my other research, of course, I realised it's only a very simple requirement to form a state, and this has been provided for in the Australian Constitution, Section 124. When they did the Australian Constitution in 1901, they provided for the creation of new states. And the only requirement is the consent of the parliament of the existing state.
Yeah.
So that's a very, very simple requirement. It's a big requirement, but it's very, very simple. So it occurred to me that we cannot prosper. We can't continue. Our livelihoods will go if we stay part of New South Wales.
Sure.
So it just occurred to me that there's only one solution that we can't overcome this dominance from the population in that urban area. We can't overcome that huge green vote and now this new vote, the Sustainable Australia Party vote. We cannot overcome that. In fact, not only can't we overcome it, things will get worse because there's a little bit more to this story that we haven't covered, but maybe we'll cover in another time. So it occurred to me that there's only one solution. We have to separate from that population politically. We have to separate. And of course, that means the creation of another state. And of course, the great advantage of a state is that it has constitutional authorities and powers in Australia. And one of those, of course, and this is actually specifically defined in the Australian Constitution, Section 100 of the Australian Constitution, as far as water goes, states that water is under the authority of the states. And the exact wording is along the lines of the Commonwealth shall not, by any law or regulation, trade or commerce, abridge the right of the states to the reasonable use of water and rivers for conservation or irrigation. Now, that wordy sentence puts the authority over water within that state area totally under the authority of the state. So that's a huge advantage as far as water goes. And of course, we have management of all the other natural resources as well. There's a lot of great advantages in being a state. So instead of us being shut down, which is what we are, we have the opportunity to make decisions that will benefit us, and they will certainly be different decisions than what are being made currently, and we will prosper. We won't see our population dwindle, and that's another very obvious problem, Topher. If you drive through a lot of the country areas of the Riverina and all New South Wales and all Victorian country areas have exactly the same problem. Most of those towns are dwindling. They're either stagnant or dwindling. Their population's going away. The population that stays is an older population, a retired population, but all the younger population, they leave school, they go. And most of them go to Melbourne. A few go to Sydney, but they go there and they don't come back.
And if I can jump in, these are very much intertwined problems because the mismanagement of water, the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, the $13 billion that's been spent by the federal government to take water out of productive use, about 1/3 of all irrigation water out of productive use and return it to the environment. That's a whole other story there. But that has deep impacts on the communities. We see these communities disappearing. We see the number of the populations dwindling. We see the young people moving away simply because they don't see a future for themselves in a primary production farming community that has no water, an irrigation community that cannot irrigate. It's just, there is no future for them.
The hard truth is that is correct, Topher. There is no future because there is no job.
Yeah.
Like young people, particularly young men, if they want to stay in a particular area, they have to have a job. And if they haven't got a job, they've got to go. Yeah. They have to go. It's not a case of, I'll still stay there anyway. Yeah. No, they have no choice. Yeah. They have to go. And I will say young women's a little bit different because they can get married and if their husband has a job, they can stay. But most of them go as well. But a young man has to go. And it's really, it's a terrible situation. It's caused by the fact that employment is dwindling. And that employment is dwindling because our own state government is taking the means of production, the means of wealth production, the means of production of rice, cotton, cattle, sheep, all those good things. They're taking the means of that away, the means to produce those things. And when they take that away, they take away the jobs as well. And I think the dollars we're talking, the dollar value of the jobs that are being taken out by the Murray-Darling Basin Plan are in the billions. I haven't got the exact figure in front of me, but it is billions of dollars worth of jobs every year, not a one-off. Every year. And
it was entirely predictable. And I did my first video on the Murray-Darling Basin Authority in 2012. It's an 11-year-old video now. I think for whatever reason, every time you talk, your bandwidth drops or it can't handle it and you end up with that small picture. I've never seen this before. This is the first time I've had this issue. So I do apologise.
I'm in a bit of a remote area, so
that might be
that may be
it. So coming back to the Riverina State, what we're seeing here, or what you're proposing here, is essentially Northern Victoria, and to my mind, as I look at it, and I'm paraphrasing here, so correct me if I've got the nuance of this wrong, but essentially the areas where the water flows towards the Murray as opposed to towards the coast, be that in southern Victoria or be that in eastern New South Wales, if the water is flowing towards the Murray River, then you would propose that those people be given the opportunity to join the Riverina State, should they choose to do so.
Yeah, when we had the first public meeting, which was a few years ago, there were a couple of young men from Victoria, because I'm in southern New South Wales, not far from the Victorian border, like Echuca. I'm an hour's drive north of Echuca, and only half an hour's drive north of Barham. So, but at the first public meeting we had, there were a couple of young men from Victoria there, and they were from irrigation areas in Victoria, because the Goulburn Valley in Victoria was absolutely very, very fertile area, and made so by the huge irrigation industry there. Now, they've been shut down as badly, if not worse, than in New South Wales.
Yes, they have.
And there are a couple of young men there who said straight away, we should be together. And I said, I agreed entirely. But my initial, it had occurred to me before that, Northern Victoria, the Goulburn Valley, we have the same problems. Maybe we should go together. But it was bigger. It was twice as big as what I was already thinking about. But these two young fellows from Victoria said straight away. And I said, you're exactly right. So as far as I'm concerned, the country areas of Victoria have the same problem that we have, and there is no solution other than to separate from the urban area of Victoria.
All right.
The Geelong, Melbourne and Mornington Peninsula area.
Now, I'm completely on board with this idea. I've loved it since I first heard of it, which is getting on towards 10 years ago now that I would have very first heard of this idea. As you say, there's some history on this idea. It's not the first time it's ever been floated. You're not claiming credit for it, but you are trying to drive it forward and drive it towards something of a realisation. You've had some traction. People like Tim Quilty, the former Liberal Democratic Party MP from Northern Victoria, and a few other people that have been elected here and there have been on board this project, on board this idea, but really without much traction. What are your plans? What are you trying to do to actually get sort of popular support?
It's a case of TOFA, as you said earlier, when it's explained to you, it sounds really simple. But the fact is, these numbers are not well known. They are not common knowledge. So very, very few people have looked at the electoral maps, looked at the concentration of the population, the concentration of electorates, the number of politicians, and the consequent political power. That has not been looked at. But I looked at it, and then I thought I'll look at, I'll just look at who votes for who in these states as well, and I realised the Green vote is huge. It's huge. It's twice as big as the National Party vote. That's how big it is. But it's concentrated in those urban areas. And then with my experience in the National Party, which, as I said, was pretty disillusioning, but it was educational, and I just realised, look, this is politics, and politics. It's not a case of what's the word? It's not a case of I'll just go back to my original description of politicians. Generally, I originally thought they were on our side, but over time I realised, no, they're not on our side. And either of the parties aren't even on our side either. And I was a member of the National Party. And I was a member of in the hierarchy of the National Party. And I realised that not only the members of Parliament not on our side, the party's not on our side. And there's a number of things that led me to that conclusion, which that's another discussion again. So
So what's the pathway to actually making this a reality?
So I just explain it to people, Topher, because I've been there, I've seen it, hear the numbers, and they're all straightforward. But I base my conclusion and my objective on my previous experience, which most people haven't had. I mean, the vast majority of people are not members of a political party. They've never been members of a political party. They vote for them all the time, but they've never been there. I'm just saying, I've been where a lot of other people haven't been. And I do have experience, and a lot of it was not pleasant, but that's the reality.
So getting people to understand the idea is one thing, but the whole thing hinges, as you've said, in the Constitution there is a provision we can make new states, but we need to get the agreement of the existing Parliament that presides over the land of the proposed new state. That
Yep.
sounds like an impossible task. How do you get a parliament to
Yep.
agree to annex a part of its
Yep.
own state?
Exactly. And look, I'll work from the end objective down. The ultimate objective is to form a Riverina State.
Yes.
That's an absolute necessity. And I'll just digress a little bit. The more the situation's explained to people, the more support it gets. So that's the end objective. Now, how do you get the consent of the Parliament of New South Wales? Now, there's another little bit of Australian history which most people aren't aware of, and that is that the New England area of New South Wales attempted to separate from New South Wales back in the 1930s through 1967. And that's Tamworth, Armidale up there, and that sort of thing. Now, they had a referendum of the people in New England in 1967, not the people in the whole of New South Wales, just the people in New England. And unfortunately for them, that referendum failed, and there was one major reason for that. They made a mistake. Newcastle was included in the referendum. They should have just left Newcastle out. They would have won by about three quarters of the people voted to form a New England state. So, but they failed for them, and unfortunately for them. But the template that they put in place is quite right. So what I'm aiming at is to gain the consent of the Parliament of New South Wales. Eventually, we need to have a referendum, and I think that's fair enough. We wouldn't. You can't form another state without a referendum that says, "Well, do the people actually support this?" I mean, it can't be just someone's good idea. No, so there has to be a referendum of the people in the proposed state, not the whole of New South Wales. Now, that referendum, it will win because, to be quite frank, we won't have it until we know we're going to win it. We just don't. You don't have referendums if you're going to lose them. And unfortunately, that's the mistake the New England people made. So that referendum will be won, and that will be a state agreed to referendum, a state sanctioned referendum, the same as the New England referendum. If New England had won that referendum, the Parliament of New South Wales would have had no option but to consent to the formation of that state. And a Riverina State's referendum that will win, and with that successful referendum, the Parliament of New South Wales will have no other option but to consent to the formation of the Riverina State, because the people in the Riverina have spoken. And I do say that they really don't have another option, because if you have a referendum and you win it, and then just say, for example, the state of New South Wales said, "Well, stiff, tough dickies, we're not going to go along." Well, no, it's not accepted. The people in the Riverina will absolutely just not accept that. So, but the Parliament of New South Wales, they will know that, and they will. When that referendum's won, that state will be formed. Now, before that, it's just a case of getting the public support, and the getting the public support is, number one, just pointing out, look, we have problems here. We all know we've got problems, and realise that those problems come from the very, very bad governance that comes out of New South Wales and Victoria,
or specifically out of Sydney and Melbourne.
Point that out. Yep, coming out of Sydney and Melbourne. We can see these things, but it's like these numbers that were explained a little bit before. But it has to be explained to people, and then we realise, we just look at the numbers and say, look at these numbers. There's the concentration of electorates in New South Wales, and I'm a pity I didn't have the Victorian one as well, but it's basically a mirror image.
It's the same principle.
It's the same principle. So we look at the numbers, we look at the huge Green vote, Sustainable Australia Party vote, who are opposed to the industries that our livelihoods depend on, and just point out, look, the problems we have, they're not environmental. They're presented as environmental problems. No, they're not. They're political problems. What we have is a political problem. Now, how do we get a solution? And I will say, this is the only solution. And history has shown that nothing else has worked for a start. And people will look. It's once it's explained, it's very, very simple. There is only one solution, and for that reason, because this is the only solution that will work, that's why it will happen. Because enough people, when as the message gets out more and more and more, people will realise there is only one solution, and they will support this proposal. And even now, this is not an unpopular proposal.
No.
Particularly in the Riverina, because I'm not the only person in the Riverina that's got some separatist sentiment right from the start. There's a lot of it already there. Back from the 1860s, there was another huge effort back in the 1920s, another huge effort back then And there was another effort, huge effort back in the 1930s. Now, they failed, and there's reasons for that. If you go to the website, there's actually articles on those movements. Yeah. And the reasons that they failed, if you read between the lines, you can see why they failed. And that's a room for another discussion as well. But those mistakes certainly won't be made this time.
Well, learning from history is obviously important when you're trying to be the one that rewrites history and writes the next chapter of history. I appreciate your enthusiasm and your belief. I do find myself, you say things like, well, the New South Wales Parliament, the Victorian Parliament will have no choice but to accept the outcome of the referendum. I don't know. After the last couple of years that I've had, I don't really have a lot of faith in the goodwill of the New South Wales or Victorian parliaments to actually do the right thing. But I think at the very least we need to put them in a position where they have to at least make that choice. I'm considered. Count me in. I'm wholeheartedly on board this. I love the idea. I think that competitive federalism is one of the few mechanisms that we have of improving the way that we're governed. And that requires, in Australia, more states, and it requires the states to have greater autonomy and for the federal government to do less of this sort of legislation that just covers the entire country. Let states compete, let states experiment, and to that end, I think we need more states. Your work on the mathematics was revelatory in my mind, looking at those numbers that we've been talking about with the electorates, with the voters, completely reinforced. I was already sympathetic to the idea, but that just made it so crystal clear for me, and I applaud you for the clarity with which you've presented this.
Yeah. And one more point I'd like to make, Toph, it's actually worse than what it looks in those images there, because electorates are based on equal population, and because the population growth is mainly in the urban areas, the country areas of New South Wales and Victoria, in New South Wales, we lose one electorate every 5 years. Wow. And that electorate basically transfers into the city. The country electorates get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they get smaller around that urban electorate, that urban area as it is. So we lose one electorate every 5 years. Victoria loses one every, this might sound bizarre, but it's around 4 to 5 years. Victoria is actually worse than New South Wales. If you look at the original electorates back in 1904 compared to what they are now, and on the website, the Riverina State website, there's the New South Wales, there's every single electoral map since 1904, and you can just see this digression of this reduction in the number of country electorates in the country, and the increase in the city electorates, and Victoria is the same as well. But the problem with that is there's only 8 electorates west of the Great Dividing Range. Sure. If we lose one every 5 or 6 years, now at that rate, if that trend continues, we will have one member of parliament west of the Great Dividing Range in New South Wales. One. We've got 8 at the moment. We will continue to lose there. So it's not like the situation is stagnant and maybe we can battle our way through it. No, the situation's actually getting worse. It's absolutely getting worse. And if anyone thinks, oh no, look, we'll argue our way out of it, they'll see common sense sometime. No, they won't. No, they won't. They don't see that the common sense, what we would call common sense, but they don't see that now. And by the fact that we lose that our amount of representation, we effectively have very, very little to no representation now. In 40 years' time or 50 years' time, with one member of parliament west of the Great Dividing Range, we effectively will have no representation. We might as well. Well, we'll have blown. If that happens, we're already gone. If that happens, but I don't. I hope that this happens before that happens.
I want to finish on
before that potentially happens.
I want to finish by discussing some information around what this new state would look like. How would its population compare to other existing Australian states? Give us some parameters. What about the GDP? Where would this state kind of sit? Are we talking about some micro state that's going to be, smaller than Tassie in terms of population, smaller than Northern Territory in terms of GDP? Are we talking about a more substantial thing? What does this thing actually look like when it's all said and done, if it were to be the size that you would envisage it being?
I think there's between 8 to 11 electorates west of the Great Dividing Range. Depends how far towards the coast you want to go into in New South Wales. But in the 8 electorates west of the Great Dividing Range, there's already, and one of our members Now, don't ask me how, but he accessed the tax records for those electorates compared to Tasmania.
Okay.
The Riverina area, just in there, without the Victorian part, without the Goulburn Valley, is already wealthier than Tasmania.
Right.
The value of the production in that area is greater than Tasmania already.
Yeah.
The population, look, I don't know. I think Tasmania has around about 500,000 voters. The 8 or 9 electorates west of the Greater Dividing Range have about 400. I think it's about 420,000 voters now. So
once you combine Northern Victoria in with that, then you'd have a state that's actually more substantial than Tassie.
Than Tasmania, and you're approaching South Australia. Yeah. South Australia's got, I think, 1.2 million, a population of 1.2 million, or maybe it's 1.2 million voters. I'm not quite sure, but with the Goulburn Valley, the northern areas of Victoria, and it may well even be more areas of Victoria. I think every country person in Victoria would be interested in leaving Victoria.
I think there'd be a lot of people down Gippsland Way and Sale Way that would be sitting there going, please, us, can we join you?
Yeah, they've got a huge timber industry in Gippsland that's being shut down. And New South Wales, like I've only sort of illustrated the historical Riverina area, but around Tumut and those areas, in those mountainous areas, there's a huge timber industry there, all the way to the coast. Now they're being diminished now, and they will follow the same way that Victoria's gone. So I think there'll be a lot more interest beyond even the area that I've already nominated, which is the Riverina area of New South Wales plus Northern Victoria. I think Gippsland would be very, very interesting.
Yeah, it's certainly
because
the
governance that comes out of Melbourne, to be quite frank, I think it's worse than New South Wales.
You'll get no argument from me. I just left Victoria for exactly that reason. Look, David Landini, this has been an absolute pleasure. I've thoroughly enjoyed this deep dive. The riverinaState.com.au is where anyone can go to learn more. You've got such phenomenal information, historical information, demographic information. It really is, for me, I have yet to see anyone come up with anything resembling a reasonable counter-argument to this. It just seems to me like one of those ideas that once you see it, you can't unsee it. How, in your gut, no one can predict the future, but in your gut, how long is this project? How long before we can have that referendum that we're sure we're going to win?
Topher, that is a little bit hard to predict, and I really don't want to try and predict that because if I don't want to set a boundary and then fail to achieve it. It does, or set a line and fail to achieve that, get over that line in that time period. It is a big job, as in getting the message out there is pretty big, and concentrating penetrating the mental attitude of a lot of people is another quite big thing as well. But at the moment, it's a case of just getting the word out there, and I can assure you, as you've seen, this is a very, very simple concept. The numbers are very simple, the reasoning's very simple, but it's indisputable, and it's just a case of explaining it to people so that they realise, gee, things aren't going so well. I don't know why, but when you look at the numbers and that, you can see it pretty clearly. So it's a case of just getting it out there, and that's what I'm in. That's the process I'm in, and also others as well. We're in that process of just getting that word out. And to be on your show, Toph, I mean, it's a great opportunity to get it out, there as well.
Look,
there's a lot of the country newspapers are very, very interested in this as well. It's a very interesting story, but they can see the problem as well. Like you've got a lot of newspapers, their own jobs rely on the economic health and prosperity of the population in their areas, and all the shires in New South Wales, pretty well all of them, they're either stagnant in population or in huge decline. Some of the shires, and I won't name the particular shires, but I do know the population decline in some of the shires in New South Wales in the Riverina have declined by 1/3 over a 40-year period. 1/3.
It's extraordinary.
There's only 2/3 of the population in these shire, and the shire boundaries haven't changed.
And to put that in perspective, that's at a time over those same 40 years, the population of the state as a whole would have doubled. So the actual the contrast between these regional areas and the more highly populated urban areas and the trajectories they're on is literally polar opposites. Look, David,
Yep, that's
I've
right.
appreciated this deep dive. We do have to call it there, but I just direct everyone that wants more information on this, and I would encourage everyone, go to the riverinaState.com.au. This is a subject that we will be touching on a regular basis here on the Aussie Wire. Consider me on board in the same way as I'm on board with the Murray-Darling Basin and just eradicating that horrible plan that's doing so much damage to farmers. I do think that this is a wonderful solution. It's actually great for the urbanites in Melbourne and Sydney. They can get rid of those pesky country people out of their electorates and out of their cities. And I can say we now because I've left, and we will happily stay away from them if they just leave us the hell alone and let us get on with our lives as well.
That's right. Yes. And Topher, you're actually in the Riverina now, so congratulations.
Thank you. And it's something of a homecoming. I was actually born in Corowa, so even though I've lived 39 of my 41 years in Melbourne, I actually from the Riverina I came, and to the Riverina I have returned. So there's something of a homecoming for me here. Look, David, it's been such a pleasure. We will have you back on, and you and I are going to be talking. We've got some conferences and other things coming up later this year, and I would definitely want to be talking to you about that, because I'd love for the Riverina State project to have some representation at those. So this won't be the last. If you're an Aussie Wire insider or a viewer, this won't be the last you hear of the Riverina State. David, thank you so much.
Great to be here, Topher.
Cheers.